Hello, I'm Bronwyn Williams, and we're back with the small print. And today my guest is Chris Hattingh. Chris, as always on the show, we get our guests to introduce themselves. So tell us who you are, what are you doing, and where are you in the world?
Thanks very much, Bronwyn. Great opportunity to be on with you, an avid follower of your work. So I'm really going to enjoy getting to talk to you today. Yeah, I'm the head of policy analysis at the Center for Risk Analysis. So in a nutshell, I get to read government policy, try and assess where things are and where things are going at the moment, how we got here, where we might be going. Also try and do some sort of scenario planning for our clients to give them some sort of options about what might shake out in terms of economics, policy, social instability, all that sort of stuff over the coming months and years. And just some more personal background, I've got a master's degree in philosophy. So that's my meta background. So I enjoy the theory and the reading a lot. And then I get to try and implement these things in terms of real world solutions and sort of practical, I guess, examples of the importance of ideas and ideology, how it shakes out in the real world.
Well, exactly. That's why we've got you here today to do a bit of a retrospective on what happened with the budget speech that went on last week. We are sitting now at the end of February for people that are watching this a bit later in time, but things are obviously in a very interesting phase in South African politics at the moment. It seems to be that the consequences of our choices have caught up with us and then some. So let's get into it. In terms of the budget that came out this year in 2023, what are the key takeaways from your perspective that you think are going to have a big impact on both policy and, of course, us citizens that have to live with those policies?
So perhaps the most important, and that could put the most pressure on the government, and of course then force it maybe into more radical decisions, more radical actions over the next 12 months as we head toward what should be an election and at the latest August of next year, if all things go fine, is the debt servicing cost. So increasing debt as a proportion of GDP, government spending. This is things like social welfare, support for state-owned entities. I mean, everything. Government doesn't, unless it starts printing money, of course, it doesn't get its own money. It gets it from taxpayers. It has to use that for debt servicing costs. Otherwise, it'll default on its debt, for example. So in that regard, what I want to highlight.
Isn't it sitting at now at 15 cents on the rand, or something like that?
Yes, yeah, exactly. And over the next 3 years, we're going to spend around R1 billion per day to repay those debt servicing costs. So I think very important to keep that in mind. If you look at that debt to GDP ratio, as indicated by Minister Godongwana, this was projected at 73% for 2025-26, and this is compared to the 70% projected in last year's October medium-term budget policy statement. So you can see the steady increase in terms of those debt servicing costs. And the biggest driver of this is the money that'll be given to Eskom for debt relief. That's 254 billion rand over the next 3 years. So the SOEs by no means being let go. This talk of radical reform and this version of a developmental state that we have in South Africa, that the ANC is asking questions about whether this works or not, that is not being let go by any serious measure. You've got continued support for South African Airways, for example. That's getting another 1 billion rand, 2.4 billion rand for the post office. What the post office still does, I think, is a good question in and of itself. And then, as I mentioned, that 254 billion for Eskom. To me, those were the biggest, that's the biggest risk point, is the debt servicing costs, what radical stuff that might push the current government into, and the pressures on the treasury in that regard. So next year, as we have the elections, are we going to have an increase in terms of social welfare, social spending? You didn't have a commitment to a basic income grant, but you did have a continuation of the social relief of distress grant till March of 2025. And in my view, that's effectively a basic income grant, just by a different name, calling a rose by really any other name.
Particularly shade of obtuse to say that it's not, in effect.
Right, 100%. Yeah. So you've got some arguments now where people are saying that the current ruling party is realizing the harsh reality on the ground, but I don't think you're seeing that maybe in terms of real radical reforms in terms of fiscal spending, all that sort of thing. Now, to play devil's advocate, I think another point to highlight, a key takeaway from the budget, was that debt relief for Eskom comes with certain requirements by Treasury. So you've got this argument that it's a sort of privatization by stealth. Certain power stations need to be privatized. Certain other steps need to be implemented with getting the debt off of Eskom's books. So if Treasury holds the line on this, and again, you've got those social, political pressures as we've got the elections next year, maybe then you could say, okay, this is now being done in a longer form sort of view. But I think at this point in time, the incentives and the pressures just point to maybe the line not being held on these sorts of fiscal commitments.
So where else do we have leaks in the bucket at the moment? You've mentioned the SOEs, which everybody knows about. I mean, by now, if you don't understand that South Africa's SOEs are very expensive projects, for better or for worse, then you'd be sleeping under a rock. And of course, then the social grants, which is something that is becoming more expensive. Do you have any figures on that? Like what percentage of our population is actually sitting on or reliant on these grants for some sorts of really day-to-day living, and also what it's costing us in terms of the budget, and if those expenses have increased. They did increase dramatically during COVID, but have there been further increases since then, and what's the trend in that regard?
Mm-hmm. So in terms of the social spending, the number of people in employment, we want to especially highlight here, to put this in the broader context of economic growth, you had from 2008 till now, the number of people in employment staying pretty much the same, so around 13 to 15 million. And that's not sustainable, of course, when you've got an exponentially increasing number of people on social grants. So according to the president in his State of the Nation address, you had around 60% of the budget, national sort of budget, the fiscus, is spent on social welfare. So that's, in my view, not a particularly sustainable trend. You've got a growing population over the last 10 to 15 years, but the number of people in employment staying the same. Where can you possibly continue to fund a system like that? You can maybe then do more radical things like printing money, et cetera, but then you just devalue the currency. So it's not going to help people in any particular specific way. If you look at where else sort of the pressure points on the fiscus, you've got things, for example, like you mentioned the support for the SOEs, but I also think more existential risk is this hope that we will continue to benefit from the commodities boom, that we can continue to export our raw materials, how much that helps the South African fiscus, things like agriculture, mining, automobiles. Those have helped the fiscus up until this point in time. But I think you're seeing in a global context with more depressed growth, more tensions around the world, things like Taiwan being, jumps immediately to mind, maybe the US becoming more insular, Europe having to deal with the consequences of war and not maybe seeing as much economic activity. Those are all vital for South African exports. If they experience depressed growth, that means less demand for our commodities, which means ultimately less revenue for the taxman. So where does that leave the fiscus? At the moment, we've got a primary budget surplus, and I think that's largely driven by the tailwind of the commodities boom. And I don't see that lasting into the foreseeable future. And just a final point, in terms of those pressures continuing on the fiscus, you don't have a real focus on getting the fundamentals right. So in terms of generating our own economic growth. So if the commodities boom is now really winding down, those sources of revenue are going to dry up. And then the fiscus, as a result, is going to suffer. And again, that point around debt servicing costs will increase even more. Where is government going to compromise or not? Will they go to the World Bank cap in hand? I think probably not. That has its own serious risk points in and of itself. But I think these are all things that the bureaucrats are going to be faced with in a very harsh way pretty soon.
Okay, well, let's start further with looking at where the money is going to come from. So we've covered some of the big expenses we're looking at, obviously debt servicing, obviously social grants, and obviously the SOEs supporting them as we go forward. But where the money is coming from is either from debt investment or from like the domestic GDP and taxation, all of which have their own challenges. So we can kind of get into all of them. The first one being the debt. As much as the MMTists of the world think that we can just sort of print our way through these things, once you start to reach, as we say, hit now gray status and like blacklisted status and all of these wonderful colors that we get applied to our economy, and red in the red and all those sorts of things, it becomes harder and harder to get access to debt. And it's one thing if you're able to get debt in your own currency, then you can dabble in dangerous ideas like modern monetary theory and lots of money printing. But when you sort of run out of credibility, you also kind of run out of international credit. And the greylisting is quite a big thing that came out right after the budget speech. It's obviously all connected. What are your thoughts there on our ability to get access to further debt from offshore going forward? Like, or is that going to just dry up?
Yeah, I place this answer also in that global context. So you've got now high interest rates, inflation continuing to remain, to use the nice word, sticky at best, but you've got this focus on monetary policy and not on supply side issues. So reserve banks can continue to hike rates, but that doesn't mean that they're going to deal with the root causes of inflation, things like increasing the money supply during lockdowns and then devaluing currencies, also lockdowns themselves impacting on global trade, increasing those costs, which in turn again feed into higher consumer prices, higher consumer goods, again that inflation aspect. So if you don't resolve the supply side issues, you shouldn't expect inflation to go away anytime soon. To try and counter that, of course, reserve banks, central banks have been hiking rates over the last year. They'll probably continue into this year, maybe start winding down by the end of the year. You'll have a bit of a weaker dollar, which will be good for emerging markets. But I don't think it's going to reverse. You're not going to have cuts anytime soon. So if you now, in that global context of high inflation, sticky inflation, low growth prospects, more global tensions, maybe more isolationism and protectionism, you're just disincentivizing people from investing and dealing in your country if you, for example, get greylisted. So you increase the risk premium of your country. Then you drive people to go to other places, maybe other places in sub-Saharan Africa, maybe Latin America. Those global investors, those global lending bodies, those international businesses, you all need to create jobs. You can have your social compact, your presidential promises. You need capital to create jobs, ultimately capital investment in your country. If you disincentivize that sort of thing, then you're not going to have real job creation anytime soon. So South Africa can now start to do things to try and get itself off the grey list. I think President Ramaphosa this past week in his weekly newsletter said that we should look at this as an opportunity to combat financial crime, as though, you know, you shouldn't have been doing that in the first place. And one can definitely be skeptical about whether things will get done. So there is a way to get off the grey list, but whether we've got the sort of intelligence services capacity, the police capacity, I think is very much a question open for debate and discussion. And ultimately, you're going to see a downward trend, I think, in terms of getting access to international markets, to sort of lending, that sort of thing. This is not to say it's going to happen overnight. Of course, I hope the trend gets reversed eventually. But at this point in time, you are sending a signal to the world that maybe people's capital and their investments is better off elsewhere. There's always risk in investing in anything. I mean, I think anyone who promises you utopia and 100% returns, you should be very skeptical of, especially if they're a politician. But at this point in time, we're just increasing our risk premium even more and sending the signal that maybe don't take that risk on South Africa.
Well, in terms of the grey listing, again, best case and most realistic case, how long will it take us to get off? So assuming we get all of our ducks in the row and the president has actually meant what he said, and we'll put all the things in place that are required to get it off, to get us off there. What's the best case and what's the more realistic case from your perspective as a policy analyst?
I think the best case is 3 years. So maybe now you had in the previous few months the passing of 2 pieces of legislation, sort of anti-terrorism financing, all this stuff. So you've got the legislation, sort of, you've ticked that box, but can you actually show it in terms of implementation? Is that actionable or not? How do you show that? I mean, things like the different mafias that operate in South Africa now in the coal sector, in the construction sector, can you actually show that these things are being taken to task, that people are being arrested, that these networks are being sort of broken up? I don't think you're seeing that up until this point in time. So best case scenario, I think, is 3 years. You've shown that you can do some legislation. Now you need to show actual implementation. But I think it's likely at least for 5 years we'll be on that list. And of course, you need to provide regular updates and that sort of thing so that the Financial Action Task Force can assess these things. So it's all on a spectrum, it's all gradual. But now that we're on the lower rung of the ladder to try and climb up there again, and you've also in the first place not got that ability to maybe start climbing. First, you need to cultivate the right sort of institutions, the right processes, the right sort of skilled people. Can you get them into these institutions? I think at this point in time, maybe the signs, unfortunately, pointing downward.
Okay, that's not particularly positive, but let's talk about the other problem with investment at the moment. And you touched on this a bit earlier, talking about our manufacturing and our mining, so sort of primary and secondary economies that our economy is so dependent on here, because we're not a fully financialized economy by any stretch of the imagination, certainly not for the vast majority of the population. And what's happening there with not just the sort of global supply chain and global sort of economic environment, but also what's happening now with regards to the greening of the global economy, and how we've heard quite recently about all sorts of things like car manufacturing and our car manufacturing plants being set up for petrol-based cars, which are now being phased out of Europe altogether. So there's markets growing supplying up there. And of course, the various other green premiums in exporting products from a country that is dependent still on dirty coal, which means that we're effectively tainted, much the same way your BBE scorecards are dependent on your suppliers. It all affects your score. Here, your sort of green credentials of wanting to tap into the global market, particularly the European market, which has obviously been our longest sort of trading partners. We have a lot of flow going there. You have to have a green, clean supply chain all the way down to source, which we can't have as long as anything is touching Eskom, which is pretty much every single industry that we have mentioned. What are your thoughts there in terms of the green premium, both coming and going, and if anything, we can and should be doing in order to retain a share in that market? Because the cost of doing business is up to the private sector as long as the overall grid is deemed dirty and it's essentially uninvestable.
Yeah, just this past week, we had the CEO of NAMSA coming out with their own concerns around South Africa's lack of an electric vehicle policy. So they were promised that in the budget, there was going to be more details on this. There was apparently just one sentence on this particular thing around sort of support for EV development broadly, but nothing in terms of actionable plans. I think as of last year, November, there was supposed to be a white paper published, but that still hasn't come out. I'm speaking under correction, but this is the latest that I read on that. So again, that uncertainty, that in and of itself increases that premium that you mentioned. So that increases the cost of doing business. Maybe you should invest elsewhere in your automobile manufacturing supply chain versus investing in a place like South Africa. And then the concomitant job opportunities go with that. You lose those job opportunities in turn. Looking at Europe specifically, I think it's by 2035 that they want to ban the import of internal combustion engines. So I think a huge target on their part, and I would argue very much unrealistic given where they get their supplies from, and also just those countries where they get their supplies from, they maybe don't realize some of the realities on the ground. So in South Africa, you now want to green many industries, including automobile manufacturing, but in the first place, you don't have reliable electricity supply to improve things like technological investment, skills development, just running sort of basic factories and operations. So never mind those issues. You sort of overnight want to establish things that maybe you're not doing the basics for. And then you could argue, where does that funding go to? That's the other sort of risk point and the risk concern. Does it go to, certain connected patrons and cadres and that sort of thing? Does it actually get spent on what it should get spent on? All of that, the billions of dollars that we're getting from the US and the EU, you could ask, is that really going to be used to improve and green industries or not? And then just a final point on sort of that green premium again, I want to highlight here especially copper and how important that is for green energy, green technology, et cetera, et cetera. If you've got copper suppliers from places like Peru, exposed to more social instability, places in Africa, further higher up, apart from sub-Saharan Africa, where do you get those supplies from for your copper, for example? And is that from a place that you can quote unquote call sustainable, socially responsible? Is there exploitation happening by those governments of local labor, local manufacturing, et cetera, et cetera? If you get those to manufacture your vehicles in South Africa, export them to Europe, is that again fulfilling those requirements from the European Commission, for example? How do you justify those? And if you can't, where do you then get those sources from? So I think it's a big question for the automobile industry. I think there's very much an argument to be made for maybe either you continue to wait and you say you want to engage in social compacts and you'll talk to government when it suits them, sort of thing, or you can try and now figure out from your customers what they require, what those agreements could be. Maybe it's more a company to company agreement or that sort of thing versus a state to state agreement. Maybe trying to deal with those in as best a way you can. I'm not saying that it's easy for me to say, try and deal with those regulations and try and just do it overnight. But I think if you don't start exploring options, then you're going to be at the sort of continued judgment of bureaucrats who sit in places like Brussels and Pretoria, who decide sort of countrywide and continent-wide what certain tariffs and premiums must be. Versus if you do it more company to company, peer to peer, maybe you can get more agile agreements in place so that you can better navigate these issues. I don't think the whole green it's not a fad to call it that, because I don't know. I think there's too much money behind it for it just to be a fad. And sort of interest for it to be a fad. But you need to know that you're going to have to deal with these things going forward. So don't be caught off guard by it. Don't be caught by surprise by it. And then, you have to implement those plans to be as future-proofed as possible, I guess.
So additional costs, additional complexity with connecting to the global economy. We don't have a choice to opt out of it because we are far from sustainable here by ourselves. In terms of looking at the sort of international investment opportunities to get actual capital into the country, given all the sort of challenges we've outlined today, what are your thoughts on looking elsewhere, particularly towards our other friends in BRICS and perhaps our new questionable friends that might be joining BRICS even further, with the likes of Iran and Saudi perhaps joining the alliance? What are there any sort of lights or rays of hope at the end of the tunnel that there could be investment coming from that side of the world rather than looking at Europe, which is obviously going to be looking quite closely at our green credentials, at our grey listings and all the rest of it? Do we have more leeway with our somewhat questionable friends in the emerging axis economies across the world that we seem to be playing war games with and building all sorts of alliances with?
No, absolutely. I think you're exactly right to highlight that, given this desire by countries like China and Russia to act for, or at least help, the so-called global south and those countries that are in, it's not just geographically, but maybe economically and sort of psychologically, those countries that feel that the West and sort of the US, UK have dictated to them certain sort of moral terms, whereas there should be more, I don't know, recognition of differences or
dollar-based monetary theory, right?
Right.
Dollar-based money printing is a direct act of war across all of that I've mentioned, right?
Yes. Yeah. So if you've got also maybe something like China introducing its own currency to try and compete with the dollar, maybe then there's a case for South Africa wanting to use that currency maybe and not having to deal with that dollar denominated debt. So I think you are right to highlight those opportunities that could come down the line, because of course those countries like Russia, Saudi, Iran, China, I mean, China especially, it desires global stability and global growth. So I think there's an argument there that they'll want to invest in places that they feel that there's a bit more return on investment. Now, can South Africa get its own policy ducks in a row? I think that's always going to be difficult. So whether it's from the West or from somewhere like China, can you really sell this picture of stability and sort of the reality on the ground that it's a good place to invest in? But I think at least you're going to have options in terms of trying to procure different investment and from different places. So you need to ask, are you comfortable dealing with a certain government or a certain company from another country, and then proceed accordingly? I think the government at this point in time, if the ANC continues to be the majority government, which doesn't look likely in next year's elections, but if that is the case, for example, I think for them psychologically, it'll be a very difficult pill to swallow to go cap in hand for sort of debt relief and stuff like that from the West. They would much rather to go to other countries. So the signs and the incentives point more to the current government wanting to procure investment and assistance and those sorts of trade plans and compacts with other countries versus maybe the US and the UK like they have done before.
Yeah, but I suppose that none of these things are cost-free, because aligning blatantly with that sort of trading bloc, particularly given the current geopolitical standing of the world, also comes with a closing of other doors. It could be opportunities with the former sort of Western alliance partners, where as those lines become more defined in a much more bifurcated world. So of course, all of these things have some sort of trade-off, but given our current reality, it might be that that's the most pragmatic way forward, even if it doesn't sit morally or ethically with certain swaths of the population who could be watching this. I think it's a very complicated choice, but as you have outlined, given the current political powers in our country, given their history, given their ideological sort of leanings, it does seem to be that pragmatically and ideologically, we could look at more alliance with the BRICS side of the world, for better or for worse. And I suppose as a futurist myself, looking at population growth trends, that's not necessarily a bad bet in terms of just the only hope for growth in the future is definitely coming from the southeast of the world, and certainly not from the northwest. So again, that doesn't necessarily sit well with people from an ethical, moral, whatever your ideological point of view is, but we have to kind of be aware of the trends that are driving both the ideological ones and the economic ones, and the population ones that are driving the world in a particular direction. But that's still looking outside, looking in. But what about on the inside when it comes to the other income question, which is the money that we're generating ourselves? In other words, taxes. What's happening there? What's happening on the income side of our balance sheet? Are we still making money? Are we still losing taxpayers to immigration and for sale signs on their sort of Parkhurst property lawns? Or has that sort of tide of the capital drain, I don't want to call it the brain drain, because I think that's a complete misnomer. It's just, are we still hemorrhaging rich people? or have we stemmed that tide? And is business making up any of the slack? How are we looking with income tax and with corporate tax in South Africa? Because we got a lot of bills to pay.
Absolutely. I think SARS has improved its tax collection over the last 2 years. So they are, from their point of view, doing better in terms of cracking down on people who haven't paid taxes in the past. In terms of that wealth flight or that capital flight, I think South Africans who had the means and who especially had children who they wanted to expose to other education opportunities, they have already immigrated. But I don't think it's a flood anymore. I think as such, it's sort of become a trickle. Those who have been able to have done so. For others who are still maybe in some definitions upper middle class, they are finding it more and more costly and more difficult. So especially moving to places like the US and the UK with cost of living, if you, for example, still earn your salary in rands, it's maybe not going to be sustainable or possible anyway to immigrate physically. Maybe you could try and do some offshore investments or that kind of thing. But many people are simply going to be sort of stuck in South Africa and try and make the best of the current sort of situation. If you're still upper middle class, you can still live a somewhat comfortable life, sort of protected from the worst decline of the state, et cetera, et cetera. Then on the other hand, you've got, I think, corporate income tax climbing. You had the adjustment for inflation with the tax brackets. So that means effectively that government is trying to lessen some of that inflation pressure on the fiscal treasury side, but it doesn't mean it's going to be sustainable for the future, especially if you've got this trend again with the increasing amount of percentages of people on social grants and repaying the debt servicing costs. So you've got I think the one hand, you've slowed the trickle of the really wealthy. But on the other hand, you need to ask on the sort of origin side, are you really creating the environment to help increase that supply in the future? And I say very much not. So you don't have the right policies and plans in place to encourage investment, capital formation, skills formation in the country. So that sort of base that you rely on is eventually going to wither away, be it by immigration or just by people becoming older and sort of investing offshore or dying off. And where do you get that future where do you get that wealth creation in the future? I think there's an element of taking wealth creation for granted. And we think it's always going to be the rich and the wealthy and they can fund taxes and the social spending. But you need to ask what creates wealth in the first place? Where does it come from? All that sort of stuff. And I don't think there's that acknowledgement really that you are not incentivizing wealth creation in the country at this point in time.
Well, in terms of the numbers, for people that aren't that familiar with South African setup, like how many individual taxpayers are there that are actually still net tax contributors to the fiscus, right? And we spoke earlier, like around over 60% of South Africans are in some way dependent on social grants. But of course, the other people are not dependent on grants, but are still net tax beneficiaries when it comes to the full bouquet of social services that we have access to, because we do have access to a lot. Even if our service delivery and our social contracts are breaking down, you still are a lot of benefits for living in society. There's a benefit package that has a cost that you and I are all consuming. Some of us, of course, contribute more in terms of tax than what it costs for us to benefit from our collective social goods, but many of us are net takers in that regard. So what is the balance looking at there? And what I'm getting at there is how that affects democracy in the election coming up. But do you have access to that sort of information? I know that previously it was something like, like every taxpayer looked after something like 4 other non-taxpayers, for example. But what does the ratio look like there of between sort of, dependents and independent taxpayers, essentially?
So on the personal income tax issue and that sort of tax base and setting the context, I guess, for who funds all that social spending, all that welfare, this grand caring society that we have by force. So the actual numbers in terms of personal income tax, you've got that being the largest source of tax revenue in South Africa. Between 2003 and 2012, the number of those taxpayers grew by 7%. However, those gains were eroded by a 2.1% decline in the number of taxpayers. So you had the amount maybe increasing, but the number declining. This is according to data from SARS. So again, take that sort of from whence it comes. As of 2020, you had only 5.2 million individual taxpayers, and we've got a population of, around 60 million. So those 5.2 million individuals represent approximately 9% of the population. They contribute around 40% of South Africa's total tax revenue. And if you want to go even drill a little bit deeper, about 20% of individual taxpayers contributed to 3/4 of personal income tax revenue in 2020. So as you've now got, again, rising inflation, whittling away people's spending power, you've got the devaluation of the rand. I think in the first 6 weeks of this year, the rand lost about 7%, 6% of its value against the dollar. So people's money not going as far as it used to. That tax base, both in terms of numbers and also just spending power and contributing to the sort of fiscus, steadily trending downward.
Yeah, that's not a particularly sustainable trend. In your view, how does this then map onto social stability and the social contract question coming into election season, right? Because of course, from my perspective, once your democracy gets to a point where more than half the people are dependent on the current government's social grants, you don't really have a democracy anymore, right? Because the government is no longer working for the people. The people are dependent on the government. And of course, there always should be some sort of safety net. I mean, like the whole point of society and what makes us humans different from any other animals, that we do look after our sick, our young, our indebted, you know, like we look after the weak and those that need help in our society. That's the positive of living in a society. That's why we want to have these things, and we should have some sort of buffers. But when it gets to a point where the ruling party is effectively determining what and who gets to eat, you kind of don't have a healthy social contract anymore. And how do you actually come back from this, right? Because I mean, like we spoke a little bit about the conversation of the black sash has been going on quite a bit, that we should be extending that universal basic income, formalizing it, officializing it, although it is de facto here already, increasing the amounts. But at the same time, you also just increasing the number of people that are dependent on the state. And that, of course, is an unhealthy society. The whole thing with like demographic dividends and growing populations, which is the great positive in Africa, is that in theory, at least, the demographic dividend means that as you have a young, healthy, fit population, you actually have less people who are state dependents, either the very young or the very old, or those few people that fall through the cracks for health reasons or whatever. When you sort of reverse that and you have a young, healthy, fit population who is also dependent on the state, how do you actually break that cycle without a huge breakdown in society? Because you kind of already passed that Rubicon. Or do you see another way sort of through this? Because if I was dependent on the state for my income, as the large majority of our country is, I'd be very hesitant to vote for someone else that might sort of rip that last lifeline away from me in a context of low employment, very few prospects for economic growth, both internally or externally. As you've sort of run through the whole list of things, it really does become a sort of a protection racket, like a complete vicious cycle. How do you break out of this? Is there a way out? Do you see the way out? I mean, this is your job, right? You're a policy analyst. You're supposed to be looking at ways that we can change these things around. I don't know. Do you agree with me? Do you think that you can have a democracy where you have more people dependent on the state that are actually paying the state? Because the whole point of democracy is it's ruled by us. The government works for us. We pay them and they give us services in exchange. But when that breaks down and they paying us to pay them, it's a whole different system. What do you even call that? So what do you even call that system of governance? It can't be democracy.
I guess you call it cater deployment or governance by patronage, you know, that sort of idea. And then also just even more deeper, the moral question of, you know, you talked about the sort of societal worth of trying to look after each other, take care of each other. But does it have moral worth if it's done at the sort of end of the barrel of a gun? Is charity moral if it's done through force? I think very much arguably not. If it should be voluntary, then I think you actually get the worth of charity, not if it's done via force. In terms of
with you there, that's not charity if it's done by force, but at the same time,
right.
Society has a price, and it's a price that we choose to pay, and that's a social contract, right? We give up some physical freedoms in exchange for a degree of physical and physical security, right? I mean, that's how the bargain's supposed to work. The richer, the stronger contribute a bit more. And the sort of the small print that we don't talk about too much is that the reason we do that is because we want to sleep safely in our beds at night. And if inequality does get too large, then we are still like the state of nature is always underneath our society, right? Effectively, the social contract is that the wealthier and the more privileged pay people not to harm them. Right. I mean, like that's the subtext. That's the uncomfortable sort of
100%,
the room of the social contract. But when that breaks down on both sides, right? Like the amount that we pay to people is not enough to placate the poorer and the weaker, even if everyone's on social grants and you've got 80% of the population on them and it's still not enough to keep you above the poverty line, that social contract is broken down from the weakest people in society's perspective. Likewise, if your wealthier substrates, those very few taxpayers, those, if I'm doing my maths right, looking at the sort of 2% of people that contribute something like 20% of the tax or whatever, that's a lot, a very big difference there. If they feel like they're not getting anything for that, those are the people that do have the means to move physically or fiscally, right? So either to financially immigrate or physically immigrate, which just further breaks down the whole sort of process there. And the line between the dependent and the independent substrates of the population just becomes that much more defined. And of course, that's where social unrest comes on board. What are the ways? How does one find one's way out of this once you reach that tipping point? And for me, that's sort of 50% level. Once you're more than half your people, because your voting majority is dependent on some sort of is dependent rather than independent, your whole sort of social fabric breaks down, and we've passed that tipping point. How is it possible to move back from that? Have there been any examples of other countries that have reached this point and rolled back? I mean, there are other very advanced social welfare states across the world that have, and social democracies that have found sort of some degree of equilibrium, but they're not dealing with those numbers that we're talking about here, right? You still have a larger degree of people who are paying the government than are being paid by the government. Have you seen any examples of how to turn this around without some sort of a violent or accelerationist end to the experiment?
I mean,
give us some hope here.
No. Off the top of my head, the examples don't jump out. But the one thing in South Africa's case is that we've got this huge sort of spread of the population. So that if you had, for example, the sort of Arab Spring, this idea, this reality of people very much concentrated, whereas for us, yes, you've got the urban centers, which are growing even more. So this could change in the future, but you still got a very dispersed population. So you're going to see increased social instability, increased social protest, because again, number one, people realize that
no one's getting what they paid for, what they signed up for. No one.
Yeah, and how else do they? This is not to justify sort of violent protest, but if people don't see themselves being heard, that sort of thing, how does that manifest? That energy has to go somewhere. It sort of has to, I guess, play itself out somewhere. So in terms of that immediate risk for South African businesses and citizens, I don't think that's going away anytime soon. You're going to have likely before next year's elections across the board promises of what politicians will do for people. I'm sure that rhetoric is going to increase even more. I don't have data to back it up, but I'm hopeful that there's a bit of a psychological break maybe in terms of that social contract now being broken by the state. So why should we continue to support and vote for those people who have broken that contract? Whether we're going to see that manifest or not, of course, is a different thing. Many people might simply stay away. We've seen a definite increase in terms of absentee voters. That could also happen next year, where you simply don't get any particular change because you've got fewer people voting, but still for the same sort of main party, unfortunately. In terms of ways out, it's a big, I guess, point and a big argument, but it's around both in terms of changing ideas and also then hopefully changing policies downstream from those ideas. So really arguing for, is 350 Rand a month from the government, is that a life of dignity and agency? In my view, absolutely not. So making sure that you both concretize conceptually and practically why that sort of thing does incapacitate individual agency, ownership, taking care of your family, your community, and then moving to different ways and focusing more on those reforms that encourage economic growth. I mean, at the moment, we have this fallacy of the sort of fixed wealth, redistributing it, and bureaucrats and politicians, because they have all this knowledge, of course, they get to redistribute it. Whereas I think we should be heading towards, or we ought to be heading towards where you've got more economic, you've got more individual wealth creation. But at the moment, those incentives are there for the bureaucrats to retain as much control as possible. Maybe that's simply going to take place given the harsh reality. So despite the best wishes of the politicians, they simply can't keep sort of control as much as they would want to. So you're going to see more and more this flourishing of people taking up that sort of individual freedom in ways that we didn't expect before, that we might be surprised by. And I think South Africa might very much be the sort of, not a test case, but one of the earlier countries where you experience this sort of thing versus what the West, those more developed countries could experience down the line. Again, if you move there, this doesn't say that these social welfare systems won't also then break down at some point down the line. So I think if South Africa, if you want to be somewhere interesting and you really want to try and test your ideas and whether what could come up in the future, there is arguably no better place to do that.
Yeah, I mean, like I have said this many times, South Africa is a preview, not a throwback when it comes to the weird Western sort of social democracy project. So it's a good place to see how the ideas in theory and other places have played out in practice. Yeah. Going back to the whole thing with the social grants, I think you touched on a good point there. They're necessary at the moment, but if we see them as an end, like we have achieved social justice by getting more and more people onto the grants, we've absolutely failed. They should be a means towards an end of getting people off those grants at some point, right? I mean, like, you know, we congratulate ourselves for getting more people onto the crutches, but we're never actually getting people off the crutches and running again, right? Like, we seem to be missing that whole part of the conversation. That maybe actually what we need to do is increase the grants dramatically, right? Like some of the other sort of UBI proponents across the world have said. I'm not saying that I approve of that, but maybe actually pay people even more to get them to the point that they're able to become actually financially independent and to do something and to move forward to get them off that crutch. Maybe what we're doing right now is we are paying people just enough to keep them trapped where they are, right? So perhaps we need to look at it either one way or another. Like you kind of maybe not giving each other enough. Maybe rather than thinking about we giving too much. We are giving too much, but we're giving too much collectively, not necessarily to the individual. I mean, like 350 Rand a month is way below the dignity level. It's hardly anything worth celebrating. But if that's keeping people, you know, surviving in terms of having shelter and food, it's a necessity. But how do you get past that and off that? Which brings me to like probably my final question for you today, because I know we've covered quite a lot of ground and there's many things we could talk about. But I want to know from your perspective, looking at the budget, bearing in mind all the various different things we've spoken about, what is your overall rating of the budget? Do you think that things were allocated correctly? Like, we obviously know there's problems with the South African sort of house of finance at the moment, like the general way we've been running the business or the house that is South Africa. But as much as we've said that, in the short term, we have to keep paying those social welfare entitlements. We have to keep the SOEs propped up because we don't have any other alternatives based on our current way that our government is structured, right? These are like necessary things that we have to pay for in the short term. But given the constraints that the poor finance minister had to deal with and the reality of the mess that they've been handed, how do you rate the overall budget, and what would you have done differently given the constraints of the actual reality of the world we live in and the fact that we don't live in an ideal society? These problems are here. They've taken many decades of the making, and they certainly can't be fixed just by sort of, you know, cutting off the taps and going full Maggie Thatcher on the place. It's simply that would lead to even faster societal decline and a complete breakdown of the social contract. Was it a pragmatic choice, or are there big things that have been missing or opportunities that could have been better played in order to set ourselves up for breaking out of some of these sort of vicious, accelerationist, declining circles and cycles that we seem to find ourselves in at the moment?
Yeah, I think the word that jumps to mind is, given the very bad situation, it was the most prudent budget that you could possibly get. And the main reason for that is holding the line on public sector wage increases. So a 3.3% increase, whereas public sector unions want, for example, 12%. Whether that might change, of course, but we're focusing on this.
It's coming, so it's strike season. So let's see how that falls out.
Yeah, as it was delivered, the line was held on that particular point. In terms of what I would have wanted differently or done differently, maybe this is too emotionalist an argument, but things like significantly cutting ministerial and deputy ministerial and sort of bureaucratic administrative costs and salaries and that sort of thing. So saying, you know, you as a minister of energy, you need to supply electricity to the country. You're not doing that. Therefore, you get your salary sort of based on actual service delivery or not. Then reallocating some of that spending, you know, things like, I don't know, an education voucher system or some sort of improving healthcare for those who really can't afford private sector healthcare, and sort of an actual incentivized system. And then lastly, you had the issue or the tax incentive around solar panels. Again, the sort of greening point, you know, wanting to encourage people, fine. But did you do it in the best way possible? So you've got now this bit of a tax break, tax relief for installing solar panels, but it's only on new installations and not for those people who have done them up until now. Are you really then encouraging that sort of forward thinking? And then secondly, it's only for the panels and not for batteries and that sort of storage infrastructure. So it's fine to have your solar panels, but what if you need that stored capacity? So when the load shedding happens for like 8 hours a day, possibly, or 12 hours a day, if you really want to incentivize people to outlay that capital, they need to have the systems in place where they can be off grid, as it were, for at least a few days at a time. So at this point in time, I think you've got these overtures of like wanting fiscal responsibility, some sort of different reforms, but it's not sort of wholesale as much as I would have wanted it to be.
Okay, so what should we be looking out for leading up to the election cycle next year? Do you have any major predictions you want to leave us with, or any points to ponder before I let you go?
I guess given the sort of harsh conversation that we've had, the sort of potential light, I guess, is given the current trends and how things are going, people's experience in terms of their quality of life, what we're seeing in our polling, other people's polling, just how the ruling party will drop under 50% in next year's elections. Whether coalitions are a better alternative to that, that's a big question that we haven't really seen it solved up until this point. Could that really be the change that we need or not? Could that result in sort of worse outcomes or not? Either way, it's going to be new, potentially epic, and I say epic as an EPOCH, epic defining election in the South African story. So you had 94 to 2007, 2007 till now. What's going to be the sort of third age of democratic South Africa, I think is very, very important to look at. And then just the last point to sort of look out for, I think, potentially more sort of labor sector, labor union action. Those things around the public sector wages, social grants, as we head towards the election, the ANC's alliance partners putting more pressure on the ANC before next year's elections to try and show them that they should still support them in the election.
Thank you very much, Chris. So where can people find you if they want to continue this conversation or challenge anything that you or I have had to say today? Of course, I don't hold Chris responsible for any of my terrible opinions, and you're welcome to argue with us there too. But if you want to talk to Chris and challenge him on any of his ideas or pick up on his work at CRA, where can they find you if you want to be found?
Yeah, our website is probably the easiest, www.crasa.com. I'm also very active on Twitter and on LinkedIn. You can find me both of those platforms. Chris Hattingh, hopefully I'm the first search result on either one. If you're based in South Africa, hopefully the algorithms play in my favor. And then also the CRA YouTube channel, youtube.com/CRA. We've got about 36,000 subscribers at the moment. We try and release weekly content with different industry experts and analysts. So follow our work there and subscribe to our channel, and hopefully we can get in touch.
Thank you so much.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and rate us on all your preferred podcast platforms. If you'd like to find out more about what we're doing, please join our Substack community via the link in the comments below. And as always, we'd love to hear your suggestions for future guests and conversation topics.